Record it?
Do we need to?
No, I don't want to record.
Okay.
Oh, good, that means we're gonna get the good stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Then never mind, you don't have Senator, you want to.
Oh, really? Where was that? I was somewhere a couple weeks ago and. Where was I? And then there are like 4 or 5 cameras out and I'm like, oh, we're not recording this.
You don't have to look at that.
Hey, did anybody always?
No.
Oh.
Tammy was.
Oh, she was?
Yeah,
I'll text her, I didn't think she was on there,
yeah.
I'll let her know.
I think it's a Zoom, but it's actually a camera.
Yeah.
Kathy, how long you gonna be gone?
A week.
Yeah.
Yeah, Saturday to Saturday.
I talked to Vince and Pam.
It's had for a year.
Oh, okay,
I met with her a year ago, she's only gotten started on the whole thing.
good,
Yeah,
they love it.
I know, she gave us tons of suggestions, and
Oh, good.
actually the Airbnb we got is one that she recommended.
Okay.
Well, I think this guy really doesn't need an introduction. I think everybody knows who Brent is. So who is he? So Brent, I don't know if you want to give him some of your background. I think you have a full background. I love your story about Bowling Green and
Oh,
all the things you did. but-
we just love where you're from. I know. I love where you guys are from. I saw, so. I was at Costco on. Saturday, yesterday, I don't know, and I saw this like QB mayonnaise, and I was like, they sell it, right?
I saw
They sell QB mayonnaise now?
Yeah.
And Lauren looks at me and she goes, you know, that's not QB, right? That's like a Japanese mayonnaise, and I was like. I had no idea, so there's like the whole QB mayonnaise, but it's a Japanese mayonnaise, not a Lima, Ohio mayonnaise.
Is that the square burger?
It is, where Dave Thomas got his idea,
Yeah.
fresh, never frozen.
Trying to buy it,
What's that?
trying to buy it, didn't get it, straight away, just.
Yeah,
Failed miserably until you added chili. And you- Where all that fresh burger goes. Yeah.
yeah, was a Burger Chef part of that too? Was it Burger
No,
or
I
BB?
love it.
BBF? BBF?
Yeah,
No,
Is that what it was?
Ford Burger.
No?
that was a different company.
It was a different
Same time, but.
That's what we're here to talk about?
Burgers.
42 patties to a pot of chili.
Oh, really?
I'm hungry.
There, 42 patties to a pot of chili.
Or during high school,
There you go.
42 patties.
The things you'll learn when you come to our mastermind.
Alright, so let me.
46, yeah.
So, I think I know everybody, but most everybody. I'm Brent Swander, I'm CEO of Columbus Realtors. Over 2 years now. So I've been with Columbus Realtors for almost 10 and a half now. Did government affairs before. And I went to Bowling Green, got lucky, my first real job. I was an intern for a minor league baseball team, and then I got lucky enough, fell into the right place, literally fell into the right place at the right time. And started in the White House, when I was 18 with frosted tips and bracelets, there are photos of this. And my very first presidential event ever was when the president came to Lima, Ohio tank plant to do a speech on a global war on terror right after the invasion of Iraq. And then, so I started that was my very first event ever, and then got lucky as a VC for a long time, but I'm originally from Van Wert, that's why we're making a Northwest Ohio connection.
Didn't that where Urban Meyer's from too?
Urban, he's actually.
Yeah.
Oh, actually.
Ben Roethlisberger spent like a really small time or a small amount of time in Van Wert. He's from Finley, but he spent a little bit of time in Van Wert. But I just realized the other day he's adopted. What's that?
I lived there during junior high and then
Yeah, there you go. Obviously he was not. Yeah, he had a very short time in Van Wert, whatever, 2 years. So what are we here to talk about? We're gonna talk lawsuits, we're gonna talk wholesaling, what are we gonna talk about?
Yes, yes. Industry,
Um,
lawsuits.
So I'll give you, so the reason I was actually a few minutes late is because there's a hearing in Columbus City Council right now on wholesaling legislation. And I found a Instagram story or reel from a local news outlet that tried to describe wholesaling, and it was truly, in my opinion, more about institutional investors and institutional buyers, not truly about the wholesale. So I sent an email to the reporter, and just said, hey, I don't think this is misleading or inaccurate, I just don't think, I think there's a confusion. Right, of what the practice of wholesaling is. So does everybody know what wholesaling is? You don't, Paul? Define it. So wholesaling is really, it's really more of a short-term business practice. Somebody offering a price for a home. With no intention of actually ever buying that home. They then turn around and sell the contract. Or sign the contract, sell the contract. Not all the time, but typically the cases that we're aware of, because when anything good ever happens, you don't hear about it. But typically the cases that we're aware of and where it becomes problematic is really on the most vulnerable populations, where these folks are offering pennies on the dollar for distressed properties. And then they go in, so let's say a home's worth, let's make up a number, 150,000 or 100,000. And I know that you are distressed and want to get rid of your property, or maybe I don't know that you're distressed, you can offer me pennies on the dollar. So I offer you 20 grand just to buy your house. Then what I do is I turn around and try to sell that contract for fair market value or more. So as a wholesaler, because I don't have a real estate license, I don't have a fiduciary duty to anyone other than myself. I do not have to disclose fair market value. I do not have to disclose that I am not a real estate professional or a licensee. I'll offer you 20,000 to buy your property with no intention of ever buying it, and then turn around and sell that contract for what I believe to be fair market value, and then line my pockets with those proceeds. Right. So where you all have a fiduciary duty to your client, you have to share comps, fair market value. Really, this is a practice typically, not all the time, targeting distressed, underprivileged, underserved, and most vulnerable populations, if you will. And so it's a way to protect the consumer. It's truly ultimately about the consumer, protecting the consumer is what it's really about. So they didn't understand the difference between institutional investors and institutional buyers. And wholesaling. So I'm just trying to set the record straight there. So what's going on with lawsuits? Here's where we are. Before I begin, I want to be very clear that as we start talking about antitrust and best practices, we will not use numbers in any way, shape, or form. We will not say percentages or numbers. We're going to throw out examples. We're going to use X% or X dollars. I've done about 7 of these speeches now to brokerages over the last month since the Sitzer Burnett verdict has been reached. And inevitably, people will say, well, but everybody knows what the standard is, and it's this, and I'm like, oh god, and like, okay, well, I won't use this number, but I'll use this number. It's like, no. So I was at one last Thursday, and it got to a pretty contentious point where I had to look at the broker and say, hey, I'm really sorry, but if the numbers don't stop, I have to leave because you're putting everyone at risk.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to preface that with, let's not use numbers. I'll get into all that in a minute. So where are we?
Brent, can you explain why that's so important?
Yeah, I'm going to in a second.
Okay, good.
So, okay, yeah, I'll just do it now. So here's where we are. You all are independent contractors. What is antitrust? Antitrust is anytime 2 or more individuals sit in a room to discuss business practices and business models. So take, for instance, Dela works for BP, Kate works for Marathon. These 2 get in the same room and say, you know what, here's what we're going to do to set prices for the industry. Or it's like Pepsi and Coke saying, hey, if you do this, we'll do that. Let's just jack up the prices. Or here's how we're going to do business together. At the end of the day, you all are all independent contractors. Each business is a different business model. So there are people who base their business and share their value based on what they believe they're worth. And we're gonna get into telling your story later, but it's just like any other HP and Apple saying, hey, here's what we're going to do. That's what it would be like for even you all to sit in this room, even with the same brokerage, and say, hey, here's what we believe should be industry norm, standard, or whatever. So that's where we're gonna get into the word conspiracy, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody follow me so far? That's really convoluted, but. So here's where we are. Back in 2019, a case was filed in Missouri, the Sitzer-Burnett case versus NAR and 4 other co-defendants. Keller Williams was obviously one of those. That case was the very first case to go to trial. That case went to trial October 18th, I believe. Gary took the stand, as well as our CEO, Bob Goldberg, our CEO at the time, Bob Goldberg, and outside counsel from NAR, which I think is, as we talk about NAR, I think is really, really important as well. From an NAR perspective, as I say at every one of these, my job today is not to speak on or defend NAR. I don't work for them, I work for Columbus Realtors. Speaking of fiduciary duty, that's who my fiduciary duty is to Columbus Realtors. That case went to trial October 18th, after a week and a half of testimony. The jury was given a very narrow set of instructions, and I'm gonna get into this in a second so you fully understand it. Was given a very narrow set of instructions, and after an hour, that jury came back to the judge and said that they wanted the damage exhibits on damages, and they came back with a $1.7 billion verdict liable for NAR and the 2 remaining co-defendants. So you have three defendants in that case. The other 2 settled pending judicial approval. That's incredibly important, because just because you've seen these have been settled does not mean that they are actually settled. The judge still has to sign off on them. What makes this case really interesting, have you all heard the term per se versus rule of reason yet? Are you familiar with that? So what's really interesting, not a lawyer, but I've spent enough time studying, listening to this as well. This was an antitrust case based on that realtors and the co-defendants conspired to inflate commissions across Missouri. So, and this is an antitrust case challenging the NAR participation rule as well. So what is the NAR participation rule? The NAR participation rule is an MLS rule that requires MLS is made up of 2 things: compensation and cooperation. The MLS participation rule requires that there be cooperation and compensation, more importantly, compensation in the MLS. And that rule is inherently antitrust, which leads to a conspiracy to inflate commissions across the United States of America and inflating homes values. That sellers should not be forced to pay the buyer broker commission. So challenging the buyer broker commission requirement, the compensation rule of the MLS. Does that make sense? So here's where the per se versus rule of reason comes into play. Per se simply means that the plaintiffs have to prove a conspiracy was committed. The defendants cannot bring in any pro-consumer or pro aspect of the MLS. Only they cannot defend based on the positive, if you will. The per se ruling really says that the plaintiffs have to prove that a conspiracy was committed. So NAR cannot bring in, and the co-defendants cannot bring in any positive aspects. You cannot defend on the positivity, if you will, pro-economics, showing most number of homes, et cetera, to the most number of buyers. That's a pro, that can't really be brought into this case. This is the first time, not the first time. This is one of the very few times that a modern day antitrust case has been ruled on by the per se rule. The rule of reason, which is another legal term, allows you to defend yourself based on the pro-competitive aspects of the MLS, right? So when the Judge Burrow ruled that it's going to be tried under the per se standard, our corporate attorney and others that I've talked to said, that's a tough pill to swallow. That's a really, really tough pill to swallow. Because most modern day antitrust cases have not been tried under the per se ruling. And it automatically eliminates certain testimony that can be brought into the court. So a jury finds NAR and the two other co-defendants liable in that case for $1.7 billion. So where are we now? I'm gonna pull up my notes just so I don't inaccurately say anything. So since it was antitrust, the judge could award triple damages totaling over $5 billion. Judge Bowe is currently accepting post-trial motions, which I'm going to get into in a second, through March of 2024. He will make a final decision on civil damages, settlements, and changes to the buyer-broker compensation system sometime in 2024, maybe even as soon as the spring. Once filed, the judgment is expected to be appealed by the defendants. So here's what we know about NAR. NAR is going to file two post-trial motions. One, to completely strike the verdict, and two, to issue a whole new trial. Those are likely not going to, I'm trying to pull up all my other notes, sorry, are likely not to pass, or be approved. And then you appeal to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, which NAR believes is a more business friendly, a more business friendly. I'm trying to pull my notes. I had them all and I just lost them. A more business friendly court. So what's interesting about that is NAR has to post bond, right? To be able to prove they can pay the damages. But what's also interesting is if NAR were to win at the trial, then the plaintiffs would have to be forced to pay that bond. So this is where the negotiation comes into play right now, because the plaintiffs don't want the bond to be they do want it to be really high so that NAR can't pay it, but they also don't want it to be so high that, by God, if NAR and the co-defendants win at the appellate level, that they are forced to pay it. So it's going to become an interesting aspect. Meanwhile, the bigger case you all probably know about is the Morrow case, right? The case in Illinois, which is more of a nationwide class action suit, the challenge is the same aspect. The seller should not be forced to pay the buyer broker commission. So if you anybody listen or watch any of the trial, it's very fascinating stuff, right? So these consumers will say, well, I knew I was paying my selling realtor or something, but I had no idea that they were going to share that commission. And it came down to transparency and a couple other items. So the Morrow case is the same case that sellers should not be required to pay the buyer broker commission. That a conspiracy has been committed amongst the companies, amongst NAR, the participation rule again, to inflate commissions and home values across the United States of America. Columbus Realtors is not a co-defendant in that case, but we are listed as a co-conspirator. So we have had to provide tens of thousands of documents, emails, et cetera, et cetera. That case was certified as a class action in March of 2023. The next status report for that case is January 22nd. That does not mean it's going to go to trial. NAR actually just argued last week to postpone that trial. They issued a statement or a written statement to the judge asking to postpone that. The defendants in that case are NAR, Keller Williams, Remax and Anywhere have already settled, and 20 MLSs are also named as co-conspirators. Like I mentioned, we are as well. So that's the two biggest. There's also a leader of LEEDER, which is a little bit different. This is a home buyer case out of Illinois as well. And this case argues that because commissions are part of the sale, that home prices are inflated and the home buyers are paying too much for their homes. So it's a little bit different where the home sellers are arguing, I shouldn't have to pay the home, I shouldn't have to pay the buyer broker. These are home buyers saying that we pay too much for our home because our realtor's commission is part of the home sale. That makes sense? So with that said, here's a few things that NAR has talked about. One, the purpose of the rule. Why is a participation rule incredibly important? Because the MLS is the true and accurate source of data. It provides the most number of homes to the most number of buyers. So a lot of folks want to talk about the European model or Australian model. You're not going to go to a single site in any of those foreign countries and find all the aggregated homes for sale. The consumer has a lot more work to do, and typically the sellers, not all the time, but typically the sellers actually end up paying more than typically in the United States because of all the fees that are incurred. So yeah, the commission, the commission is less, but the fees incurred by those sellers are often much, much higher. NAR argued that it doesn't own an MLS, nor does it enforce the rules of an MLS. That trade associations are legal. They are perfectly legal to talk about best practices and set some sort of industry standard, if you will. Think about all the trade associations. There's an association for everything. The National Basketball Association. There's the Country Music Association. There's the American Clown Association. There's the Ohio Grocers Association. There's an Ohio Newspapers, Ohio Golf Course Managers, Ohio Chamber. Trade associations are perfectly legal, and there's a trade association for everything. That sellers truly benefit by the participation rule, in that they will also argue that in the Sitzer Burnett, the plaintiffs never proved a conspiracy. That was never even brought up, was the actual conspiracy that they believed was proven. The co-defendants and NAR all had different counsel and had different defenses for the allegations and what the plaintiffs brought for the lawsuit. And NAR will also say that settlement is always an option. So where are we headed? Or what are some of the things that I don't ever want to step on a broker's toes or a team lead's toes and say, here's what you should be doing. And some will argue part of the reason of why we are here is because the associations are giving too much guidance and trying to control too many day-to-day decisions based on your business models and what is best for you, your individual businesses, and the consumers. So if I were a realtor and I were thinking about what my next steps would be, buyer rep agreements. Buyer rep agreements should arguably become the norm. Some states require buyer representation agreements. Mick, I know that Ohio is starting to have these conversations about what that looks like.
They're trying to hang a bill or an amendment on the marijuana bill. The easiest thing in the world would be to just require them by law, right? That's how you get 100% participation. And the legislature here in Ohio was on recess basically for the rest of the year, but then we passed the marijuana law, and the rules have to be set by the 7th of this week, 7th of this month, so that everybody has to come back. I think it was Andy Brenner that put forward an amendment to require buyer brokerage agreements, and they think it's got a good shot of getting done.
Yeah, I would say the industry probably mostly behind. I was at a local CEO, local Realtor Association CEO attorney roundtable on Friday. And there was no disagreement from the big brokers in that room who said, yes, we absolutely need mandatory buyer representation agreements across the state.
It was fun at, one of the roundtables I went to in Anaheim. Arizona's one, I think one of the Carolinas require them. They thought, yeah, they thought we were out of our minds that we weren't using them.
Yep.
But they had to by law, so they were just simply trained that way and never had to, get into that,
Yeah.
right?
Talk about your value. You have to talk about your value. So when you go into a listing presentation, you do more than put a key box on the door and a sign in the yard, right? How many sellers could do a net sheet on their own? How many sellers could do everything that you do? You're a counselor, you're a firefighter, you're a therapist. What are you doing, right? So after one of these speeches I gave 2 or 3 weeks ago, I literally had somebody come up to me and say, I don't even know what to tell them I do. I just tell them, here's what I expect. And I pre-fill in the number on the listing agreement and tell them if they want to work with me, here's what I charge. I said, so you don't talk about your value? Like, I don't even know what I would say. So find your value, talk about your value, and make sure that you're reiterating your value. Speaking of, don't pre-fill in listing contracts with your compensation. It's always negotiable, right? Now, I think this is a conversation that has come up multiple times. If a seller says, hey, here's what I'm willing to pay you, and you think that that is below what you should be working for based on your value, that's a business decision that you are going to have to make, right? That might become a conversation you have, hopefully not, but that could become a conversation. But hearing people say, oh yeah, I pre-fill out the listing agreement, but what I expect, I would discourage that.
So if you present, I present my value and then I say, and for that, the charge for this is 6%.
X%. You can tell your seller that we're not gonna use a number in this room.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, you're good, yeah, you're good.
Okay, I know. Okay, X%.
Yep.
Can we do that?
100%. Yeah. You think,
No. No, and if they don't want to pay agreement, you can, decline the listing.
You absolutely can do that, yeah, and say, here's everything I'm gonna do, and for my services, this is what my fee is, whether it's a flat fee or a percentage. You can say, absolutely, you can use that number to your client. I'm just saying we can't use numbers in here, but yeah, you can say, this is what I charge for my service. Absolutely, that's perfectly acceptable.
Should we go into the conversation then about expanding it to part of this is going to go towards somebody who's not working on your behalf?
Yeah.
So, part of our listing, the exclusive right to sell for Columbus Realtors is going to contain language in section 2 that says this. This is on the exclusive right to sell. Seller recognizes and permits brokerage to make an offer of compensation to a cooperating buyer broker in the MLS for procuring a buyer that closes on this property. Seller further recognizes that the listing broker has discussed that offer of compensation with seller, and that seller has been fully informed that such commission is negotiable.
Not a number broken down or anything?
No, so that was actually one of 2 options. This question continues to come up as I give these same speeches, basically. That why are we not requiring the numbers or percentages to be broken down? That was a heavily debated topic, not only in our MLS task force, but at the board of directors as well. And the brokers, for the most part, just believed that if you're putting it on paper and it does change based on any variable conditions throughout the course of the contract, that you're amending that contract over and over. And so council would also agree that that was one of 2 options that they gave, is break it down or not break it down. But our council believes as long as it is in there and they fully acknowledge that part of it may be offered, that is enough. Well, one of 2 steps of consumer protection and transparency to the seller. The other aspect that we're gonna add as part of the exclusive right to sell will be at the very bottom, where the seller will now sign it twice. That they have agreed to the contract, but they will also agree that I have read and fully understand all aspects of the exclusive right to sell and have had the opportunity to ask questions of the listing broker. So we're just trying to add in more transparency. Because again, if you paid attention to the trial in Missouri, what the sellers would say, I had no idea that I was gonna offer, that you were gonna offer that, and I could not be paying that to the consumer or to the buyer broker. Mark, were you gonna say something?
Okay, I was gonna bring it up, will there be a signature box at that specific paragraph? And then, of course, you sign the full contract at the back.
So it's not gonna be a specific paragraph, and this gets into a whole bunch of legalese. Because there's differing case law on, one of the conversations that was had, again, part of that. Of those conversations of how do we update and fully be transparent to the consumer, is initialing each paragraph. What if the consumer does not initial one of those paragraphs? So there's different case law on that. Is a contract enforceable, even if they sign it at the very end, but they don't initial one paragraph? There's different case law of whether that contract is actually enforceable or not. This is out of my realm, and I'm not an attorney, but Victor Hostetler said, don't even try that one. Just make sure you have them sign it twice and put in big, bold, black print that says, I fully understand and acknowledge and read the contract and have had the opportunity to ask any questions of the listing broker, just so you're not initialing every paragraph.
When will the new ERS be ready?
Hopefully, if not this week, maybe next week, but we do want to do some education on it as well. I mean, it's very limited, but just bring it to the attention that's out there, so.
How does that trickle down to the MLS or the data sheet as to offering compensation? Are we using zero numbers or are we using nothing?
So right now, great question. So right now, having compensation is still mandatory. But by mandatory, what I mean is that in July, NAR came out and said that zero, I'll use a number just to give you, zero is an offer of compensation. So zero is zero, but it's an offer of compensation. So our rule in the Columbus MLS, and the reason behind that, let me get into that. The reason behind that was that penny, a penny, which is also acceptable, or $1 is essentially zero, right, for the most part. And so what's the difference between a penny, $1, and zero? So NAR came out and said that zero is an offer of compensation. Part of Zoom that I was on Friday as well, NAR has said at this point, compensation is still mandatory, even though zero is an offer of compensation. So we have changed our rule that zero is an offer of compensation. But again, a penny has always been. So you can offer a penny, you can offer $1. But now zero is an offer of compensation. We have changed our rule to allow for that. And NAR has said, if you allow it, if it's not mandatory and it's optional, you are not covered under NAR's E&O policy for now.
I hear some of the MLSs are opting out of the NAR, suggesting that you don't join. Would that be a reason why they may be doing that, or is that?
I haven't heard of MLSs opting out of NAR yet, but there are MLSs that are not affiliated with an association. So Northwest MLS, which is Seattle, that area, it's a very large MLS in the Northwest, that is completely broker owned. RE Colorado is also broker owned. MLS Penn, which is Northeast up in New England, they are MLS owned, or they are broker owned as well. So they don't have to adhere to NAR policies or the MLS handbook because they are not association affiliated. that make sense?
What's our responsibilities as individuals? Do we have to join the NAR? Do we have to join the OAR? Do we have to join on this board?
For now, yeah, because you're enforcing the three-way agreement. So the three-way agreement, do we want to get into the three-way agreement? The three-way agreement essentially says that to be considered a realtor, you must be part of the realtor association. So you can go be a real estate licensee, but you cannot call yourself a realtor. And so the way the three-way agreement, it's a very unique agreement. I don't know any other association that has it. That to be a realtor, you have to belong to the state or belong to the local. And then by being a virtue of belonging to the local, you belong to the state, you belong to NAR. That three-way agreement is still in full effect. What some of the settlements have come out and said, whether it was Anywhere or the RE/MAX settlement, so they will no longer require their franchises to be NAR members. That doesn't really do anything, quite frankly.
And so, you know, Keller Williams franchise agreement has never required membership.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. So,
That's why we didn't change it.
yeah, and so, Paul, I'm gonna get into the weeds for a second on that, though. You could belong to a brokerage that is a realtor affiliated brokerage. But the way the three-way agreement works is that we as an association are not, we do bill you individually. But the way some do it, because the way the three-way agreement says, is it's based on number of licensees. So if you wanted to opt out, I hate using this example, but you asked a question, someone picked on your part. If you wanted to opt out, you would have one of probably three options. One, your broker would return your license if you don't want to pay the dues. Two, you could pay the dues assessment to be a non-member. Or three, you send your license back, pay your dues, or pay a non-member fee. Now, the non-member fee doesn't really benefit you in any way, shape, or form because it's a big price.
Sell real estate.
What's that?
Can I still sell real
You
estate?
can still sell real estate without being a licensee, or without being a realtor, yeah. Commercial members are a lot, not a lot, but there are a good chunk of commercial licensees who don't belong to the Realtor
There's probably
Association.
7,000 or 8,000 in Ohio
Yeah.
that are real estate salespersons and not there.
Commercial or?
No, not all.
Not all.
You get down into southern Ohio, it's the Wild West down there.
Yeah,
Property managers or they?
They're not real.
They're not required.
yeah, they're licensees, they're agents, they're not realtors.
I'm gonna roll it back to the beginning of it, when you're talking about court things, but 'cause I did listen to a lot of the arguments as well as reading a ton online of all the briefs and stuff that were. A couple things I didn't know, and I'm just confirming that it's true. One of the complaints was that Realtor.com ordered houses in Realtor.com based on commission base. In other words, that if you only offered 2%, your home did not come up as high as someone with 3%. Was that ever done? I never didn't realize that Realtor.com ever did that.
So no, first of all, the answer to that is no, but. I talked about the lawsuits, what I have not talked about is Department of Justice investigation. So, not only do you have all the lawsuits going on over here, you've got the Department of Justice investigation over here. So, under the previous, I want to be very clear, I do not care about what political side you're on, but these are the facts. The Department of Justice opened an investigation into the National Association of Realtors and some of these practices years ago. Under the previous administration, they settled that investigation and used the word closed. We are closing this investigation. In comes a new presidential administration, a new United States Attorney General, a new Department of Justice. And for the first time ever, the Department of Justice reopened a investigation into an investigation that was already closed. So part of that investigation required that realtors could not advertise their service, real estate agents, realtors could not advertise their services for free. That's part of the agreement that was in that as well. Even though the Department of Justice reopened that investigation, that rule that you cannot advertise your services for free is actually now codified in the Code of Ethics. So even regardless of the Department of Justice investigation, our members, realtors cannot advertise your services for free. 2, that you cannot sort commissions in the MLS by number, whether it's low to high, high to low, based on commission. Again, that was in the investigation, and agreed to terms. That has been removed. The ability to sort based on commissions has been completely removed. 3 was allowing non-realtor members. So again, these are licensees, but non-realtor members access to the lockbox. That has not gone forward. That's been paused. In 4, see, I tried to do this off the top of my head. There were 4 parts of that agreement. But anyway, so you get a new United States Attorney General. You get a new presidential administration, United States Attorney General. This administration reopens that investigation. So that is the first time that the United States government, Department of Justice, has ever withdrawn from a previously executed agreement. So NAR sued the Department of Justice, the National Association of Realtors versus United States of America, Department of Justice. Heck of a lawsuit, right? And NAR wins that case in DC. The administration, the current administration, appeals that verdict, and there was a hearing on Friday, December 1st. There was a hearing between the 2 parties and the judge of why NAR believes that that case should be closed as previously agreed upon. A contract is a contract. The United States government cannot withdraw from a contract. And the DOJ says just because a case is closed doesn't mean it can't ever be reopened. So that's their argument. But to answer your original question, is part of the DOJ settlement was you cannot sort commissions, and that is still in effect. You cannot sort commissions.
Was Realtor.com doing that?
I don't think that's why I said no. So agents would have the ability to do it in the MLS, but that no longer is the case.
And then the other thing I read as this goes into, when you said at the beginning that it still has to be, the judgment has to be codified in what you do. If 2 brokerages already settled, what I've read is it's a done deal. If you have two brokerages raising their hands saying, yes, we're guilty, that does not bode well for a judge saying, no, this isn't correct. And it ultimately comes down to not are you guilty of doing it, but is it 1.7 or 5.8? I mean, what are the damages?
Yeah, so there's an antitrust law, and those damages can be tripled. So that's where it goes from basically 2 to 6.
Yeah.
To your point about the brokerages who have settled, those settlements still have not been approved by the judge. And that's where it gets into a legal conundrum of, well, we settled, but now NAR wins on appeal. What takes effect? That's a whole legalese that I'm not versed on talking about. So, I forget what your other one was.
Well, I do have one more anyway.
Okay, go ahead.
The National Association of Realtors, at least what I remember, is the throws the number 2 amount of money at politicians, second to the NRA. So in the long run, does that matter?
Actually, it's not even the NRA. If you look at the top PAC contributors, it's typically wholesale beer and wine, the chamber, and I'm going out of order, I'm going off the top of my head. It's like wholesale beer and wine, the National Air Traffic Controllers, the chamber, banks, NRA is actually not pretty far down the list. I think it does matter. I mean, I came from an advocacy world, and having those relationships is extremely important. And you're not throwing money at them to buy votes, but you use those funds to build relationships. So when you go to a fundraiser and you see them, you become friends with most of these folks, and I worked in Congress for a little while, and so you have those relationships. Yeah, I mean, it's not like, hey, I'm gonna give you $10,000 if you do that. That's a quid pro quo, obviously illegal, but it's important to have those relationships as we move forward. What else? I think I had one other thing. What other questions do you guys have? There are a bunch of copycat lawsuits. What's really interesting about those copycat lawsuits as well is a couple of them in Texas now mention brokerages specifically, not just franchisors or franchisees. They would mention brokerages, offices and teams. Yep, and teams.
And builders,
What's that?
and builders, and so they were doing it with some builders too. Throwing them in the suit.
Interesting, okay. So yeah, you're seeing a bunch of copycat lawsuits.
And Texas is the first state to be named, right?
Correct.
State association, but they own an MLS which exposes them to that, is that correct?
Yeah, so Iowa owns part of an MLS now too. No Coast MLS.
Sell.
So, what are we doing as an association? Back in mid 2022, I was sitting with Patty Brown, right? And I think she hit on this on Saturday night. We talked a lot about it. Is we knew these lawsuits were coming. They were already there, but it was going to come to a head sooner or later. And so she created this 2023 WTF MLS. What's the future of the MLS? And we began this MLS task force that started earlier this year. So looking at everything, throwing it all on the table. What are we going to do to survive? How do we best position our members, the association of the MLS? Is it creating joint ventures with other MLSs? Is it selling off a small fraction of the MLS? So that if you have less than 1% ownership, or if you have 99% ownership, so you sell 1% or less or more, you don't have to abide by the NAR policy handbook, but then you're gonna have to go get your own E&O insurance. We're throwing it all on the table. So, we did change to 0. We're not widely advertising that, we don't have to, but we're gonna continue these conversations as we move forward about what we're doing. I can tell you, we are having conversations about mergers and acquisitions across state lines, data shares across state lines. Now, how quickly might any of them come to fruition? We don't know. But we cannot sit by idly. So one of the worst things that happened which I was around for, is when CoStar sued Xceligent in 2017. CoStar is a big commercial. It's not an MLS, it's an information exchange. There's a big difference between an information exchange and an MLS. i.e., there is no mandatory offer of compensation or cooperation. It's a listing portal essentially. And so when Xceligent went bankrupt in 2017, we were without commercial information exchange for 6 to 8 months. We can't do that on the MLS side, right? We talk about you sharing your value to the consumers. We as an association better be sharing our value as an association to you. Love it or hate it, one of the best things that this association does is advocacy. We truly take a bipartisan approach and look after you. I mean, how we sued the Department of Justice trying to protect the industry. I hate to go back to 2020, but Michigan and Pennsylvania didn't practice real estate because of our advocacy efforts. We were able to in Central Ohio. Every time a sales tax on services has come up, that's been the Realtor Association who has been able to get that struck down. So investing in the PAC, investing $15 or $30 into the political action committee, so that we can have those relationships on a bipartisan level. We had this conversation today about raising the standard of professionalism. Well, the state legislature wants to reduce or remove a lot of the occupational licensing. They believe it's an unnecessary government burden or a barrier to entry. So eliminating or reducing the standard to become a realtor or a barber or a cosmetologist, they just don't believe government should intervene into private industry and business, and so they want to reduce or eliminate a lot of professional occupational licensing. So continuing to raise the bar, professionalism, that's our job, that's part of our job and our advocacy that we do, whether it's wholesaling legislation in the city of Columbus, whether it's source of income legislation. Like, these are all things that we're actively involved in. The institutional buyers, how many homes or properties is too many to own in any given county? Is there such a thing? Is that private property rights? And let whomever wants to buy has the ability to buy. There's conversation floating around about foreign buyers. And that begs a whole lot of questions, especially around fair housing. So these are all conversations that we're not only part of, but we are actively engaged in and working. So what other questions do you have?
So kind of back to what Paul said, you said you're gonna make the buyer broker zero.
Well, it's not,
Well, it's gonna show up as zero on the listing.
no,
Oh,
no, I want to be on it. If a seller says, if you say, hey, here's what I do for you to list your home. I want you to acknowledge up at the top, going back to paragraph 2, that I may offer part of that commission to a procuring buyer broker.
right, and you're using zero.
And that, and you say, actually, I'm not gonna offer them anything. I'm going to put in 0, I'll use that number, I'm going to put in 0. That number would then appear into the MLS, but
Right,
we're not changing it to 0.
right, okay,
But if a listing broker does not want to offer anything other than 0, that's what the offer of compensation is.
Could that still be in the data sheet?
What's that?
Because the only place that shows up now is the
Right.
data
Yeah,
sheet.
yeah.
Is that where it still will remain?
Yeah.
so.
We're not changing anything. We're just saying,
So is it up in the air how a buyer agent is going to get compensated?
yeah, so,
Point?
at the end of the day, I think this is a great conversation. As a buyer's agent, you have to talk about your value,
Right,
but that's where the buyer representation agreement goes in. Okay, so I'm not gonna use numbers.
right,
And well, the other thing I want to talk about as well is that, especially as a listing agent, you should never imply, suggest, hint at that there is an industry standard, that there is a suggested percentage or dollar amount. And as a buyer's agent, you should certainly never suggest that I'm not going to show you a property that might meet your qualifications or might meet your needs, but I'm not going to show it to you because I might not get paid what I think my time is worth. Right? So as a buyer's agent, I think that's where the buyer's rep agreement is incredibly valuable. Because you still have, as a buyer's agent, you still have a fiduciary duty to your buyer to show them all properties that meet their needs and meet their wants. And if you show them a property that the offer of compensation in the MLS is below what you believe you should be paid, that's a conversation you're probably gonna have to have with your buyer. How am I gonna get compensated? So that's where that becomes incredibly valuable. So going back to the Sitzer case, in the whole Burnett case, that whole per se versus rule of reason conversation. When you go into an appellate court and you talk about the damage to first time home buyers, when you talk of, there's a reason buyer agency was created, is to protect the consumer, right? So 30, 40 years ago, whatever, the pre me being here, the whole reason buyer agency was created was to protect the consumer.
Late 80s, yeah.
Late 80s. So, that's why buyer agency was created, was to protect the buyer. So you go into a court of appeals and say, what are we gonna do? Go back to the Wild West?
right.
So this is where NAR does become incredibly valuable of advocating for that. So a lot of the things that I've heard is how horrible NAR's defense was, et cetera, et cetera. But in this specific case, what you have to remember is they were hamstrung by some of the judicial rulings that came out during the trial to insert evidence some of the evidence was allowed to be inserted by the plaintiffs, but not by the defendants, and by the whole per se versus rule of reason. So you could, a lot of our members are like, NAR didn't do enough. I'm not an attorney, I don't know, but I know the conversations I've had with our attorney and others is they were completely hamstrung by that ruling of per se versus rule of reason. And so all these copycat lawsuits, I was having this conversation out in Anaheim. People are like, oh my God, these copycat lawsuits are terrible. You talk to a couple people who I implicitly trust, and like, I think it's a good thing. Go get it in a friendly district where we can either win it at the trial level or we win by judicial ruling. And now the Supreme Court has no choice but to take it. Because you can't have disparate rulings. I mean, there are some changes. There are Thompson brokers. That's a whole other, I don't need to get Thompson brokers, but.
And two things. Number one of the arguments was given about the buyer's agents being paid less was the argument, well, the buyers are doing all the work now because everything's now online, they're choosing their own houses. And my response to that was, if that's all you were doing was provided them the MLS, then you are being overpaid and you should have your commission cut. So again, part of that is as a buyer's agent, recognizing that your job is far beyond showing them houses or getting them in the door. In fact, that's where you start your job and being able to educate and sell the buyer on that. But the second thing I said, one of the first things I did when all this started happening several months ago was I called Joan Elfline locally, who is a broker who's for years now. If you look up any of Joan's listings, she has $3 as the buyer broker commission. And then she has a second document in which the seller has agreed to compensate the buyer's agent X amount of dollars, okay, or X percentage. So I called her up and I said, Joan, go to lunch with me because I want to hear your listing brief. I want you to tell me how you sell this to your seller, what you do. And correct me, and in fact, I think she should speak in our office. I think she's already doing where this is going. And what she does is she started a sort of cafeteria style service where the seller paid her based on what they wanted her to do. And sometimes they wanted her to do nothing but put their house in the MLS and she'd charge them X amount of dollars for doing it. That's it. Your hands are off, okay? And then that grew to an agreement. Well, I also want you to do this and I want you to do that. So, but she's just negotiating for the seller. Then she would say to them, okay, do you want to compensate the buyer's agent anything? And then she would talk to them about the advantages and disadvantages of 0 to, X amount of dollars, whatever. And what she told me though, is she said, when you educate your seller, they are generally gonna land on the higher end of whatever. I mean, she said, honestly, when they understand what the buyer's agent does, very seldom do they say, no, $3, that's it, So what she does is she has a two-part education in all of her listings. And she said, it's not a hard argument to make when you educate your seller as to what I'm going to do for you. And by the way, you have an opportunity to compensate a buyer's agent for fully preparing them to close on your home. What do you want to pay them? So am I wrong? Is she already doing this? I mean, she's already got a model.
The buyer says it's doing all the work anyway.
Yeah, well, in that case, although she does say, sometimes her Lizzie, but my point is she started the model years ago of saying it's fully negotiable. You tell me what you want to pay me. And by the way, also tell me what you want to pay the buyer's agent if you want to pay it. I think you take something like that to court and you lose. I mean, because it's all full disclosure with documents and everything. So for her, it's business as usual. I mean, she just keeps going. And I think that to a degree is where the industry's going. I've always, in everything I've read and heard, I've thought this is not a problem about numbers, it's a problem of disclosure, of really understanding who's paying what, why they're paying that, and then as professionals, selling our value to the consumers so that they are willing to pay that dollar value.
Well, to that point too, we were talking about you can't advertise your services for free. I had this conversation with homeless realtor, he was in DC, like, oh yeah, I tell all my buyers that I work for free. It's like, you have just completely diminished your value,
Yeah.
right? You do more than unlock a lockbox, because they've already found it on whatever's, I mean, whether you send them all searches or not. Like, hey, I wanna see this house, you're doing way more than just allow, but if that's what they think you do, that's their perception of the realtor.
Kathy, this will make you laugh. So last month, I tried out a new pitch on the conversation around this, and I said, well, my listing fee is X. How much would you like to offer a buyer broker to bring a buyer to buy your house? Her answer, what's the standard? Where to go? That's what her answer.
So this came up last week when I spoke. What am I supposed to say when I tell them that there is a stand, what the standard is? There is no standard,
Yeah.
but here's what I charge and.
Yeah, and what I said was, there's actually no standards, completely negotiable. The competition in this price range that you're gonna be up against, 80+% are probably offering 3% as a buyer broker. Oh, yeah, sorry.
People are citing data that's out there for you to review yourself.
Yeah.
In this room.
I'm so sorry.
That's it. And then, you know, when I trained my team, I've always said, you never say to the buyer, look, you should use a buyer's agent because it's a free service. It's not a free service. In fact, the way I describe that is whenever I deal with for sale by owners, is I say, well, you have priced your home equal to other homes in the area that have sold using a realtor at a average commission of X. So since there's not a realtor involved, I'm taking X off your price. Because that was built into the price of the home. And so with a buyer's agent, it's not free. Because if they would, it's, you know, figured into what a seller is willing to take for their home. What is their net after you are paid? And so that is absolutely built in the value equation that a seller has in terms of the value of their home.
And I've always had a problem with this, but it's went the opposite way in all offer situations, but people will negotiate their fees in the contract itself, saying, we expect you to do that. What's your thoughts on that? Because I've seen it the opposite way too. Like I said, the buyer's agent will reduce their fees by a certain amount to make it look more attractive to the seller. Because they know what they're getting compensated, and my always thing with that is like, we're not allowed to.
Well, the buyer's agent shouldn't. I'm gonna be shouldn't be negotiated. It's what the seller is willing to pay the buyer broker.
Well,
Right.
when it's stated in the MLS that they're going to do this.
Yep.
They will say, we're gonna take a solid dollar amount off of that to make their offer look net better to the seller.
That happens all the time.
And
Not all the time, but it happens.
but you can do it on the opposite end too. As a buyer's agent, if they're offering 0, we can always go in on the contract, no matter how uncouth it is. So we expect or.
It's an inducement to buy. If it's an inducement to buy and sell, it's disclosed to all parties and agreed to all parties.
Yeah,
So
so
the other thing is with the buyer's agency agreement. Is that when you have an agreement with the buyer, it says, hey, this is how I'm going to be compensated, either a flat fee or percentage or whatever it is. That gives you permission to your fiduciary duty to protect the buyer. And so when a listing agent offers you zero compensation, you have the fiduciary duty to say, hey, by the way, I'm gonna help protect your coverage here. And we're gonna negotiate, $400,000 for this house, and this $400,000 will be part of the contract. And this is how I'm gonna be compensated. But you need buyer's agency agreement. It's an agreement between a buyer and the agent and the broker to negotiate with to sell. When you don't have the buyer's agency agreement, you don't have that permission to start. You know, then it becomes an inducement and disclosure.
yeah, and you can't, as a buyer's agent, you can't negotiate up.
But a seller can offer an incentive too.
What's that?
Yeah,
A seller can offer an incentive though.
builders do that.
Yeah, but a seller can't, a buyer's agent cannot negotiate up. Listing broker.
Yeah, we can't go in if they're offering 0, we can't go in and ask the seller. Is that within the contract? Is that correct?
You can't negotiate on based on MLS rules, state law, local ordinance.
Now, I say that, now I'm like, which rule is that off the top of my head? It's code of ethics says you can't negotiate. It's the MLS rule, you cannot negotiate. Let me verify that.
If we are presenting an offer and in the offer we say, seller will pay this much for, buyer's agent, we can do that.
Say that one more time. So seller,
Seller would compensate buyer's agent this percentage. We can do that we can ask for that in the contract.
If the amount being offered is lower than what that buyer's agent wants, can they say,
no.
That's
Yeah,
what
you
she's
can't
asking.
say I want more money.
But what you can negotiate is seller pay buyer closing costs. Just like we do every day. And that would technically, like if they're not offering what the expectation is for the buyer brokerage. And then the balance of that would fall back on the buyer, according to the buyer brokerage agreement. That would technically be an expense, a closing expense for that buyer. So you just can't name it as commission.
so the seller's paying their buyer's closing costs, so the buyer can pay the buyer's agent?
I can see it going that direction. I think that's what a lot of commercial, because they don't have any.
But change your drop down menu on your.
Yeah.
I was going to ask that for now, and I know we have a letter here. Right now, you cannot include a realtor's commission
They don't
as
call it commission without.
a closing cost, correct?
Right.
See, that's gonna change, because there's too much money involved. I still think politics and money are gonna steer it our way. So I think the laws are gonna change, they're gonna say real estate commissions can now be closing costs. And is essentially it's built into the price of the home, no matter how you do it.
I mean,
What?
one of the big discussions right now is veterans, right? Because the
Yeah.
VA specifically says the veteran cannot pay a fee or commission to a broker.
Yeah,
So, and I was gonna ask this, you mentioned like, appeal, you could bring in pro evidence. Like, I can't remember the term, but it's like when a business practice creates discrimination without intending to.
Disparate impacts.
Yeah.
Isn't there like, if buyer's agents, isn't there gonna be an inverse amount of impact on lower income minorities?
Oh, yeah.
Veterans? Like, isn't that all the reason why this settlement should be?
Yeah, so that you bring in all those arguments, the fair housing components.
Yeah.
The disparate impact components, I could get on a tangent, but all those pro-competitive aspects will be hopefully brought in, assuming the judge grants you file for an appeal and hopefully there's a hearing and you move forward. So I would say, sorry, no.
That's okay.
I would say ultimately, I truly, in my heart of hearts, believes if we get it to Supreme Court, we win. I do. First challenge is to get it there, right? Because if you lose on appeal, you can't get it there, right? So you've got to get it to the Supreme Court, at least one of these or a couple of them. Whether it's a copycat, the moral, the leader, the Gibson, you can name all these copycat lawsuits. I think you get it to the Supreme Court, it upholds.
what should we be doing can we be penalized a year from now when a decision is codified for not making changes now?
No, so this is a conversation I've had with our attorney. We have a couple of people. Are very vocal, loud members who are like, we need to withdraw from NAR today.
Right.
That does nothing because there's a 4-year statute of limitations. So even if we were to withdraw from NAR today, we're still held liable. So there's a difference between being guilty and liable too. So if you're found liable, not technically guilty, not that really matters in the whole grand scheme of things. You can still be found liable for practices up to 4 years ago. So even if we were to say, you know what, we're not going to be members of Ohio and National, keep in mind, you could not call yourself a realtor. You would have to change all of your marketing material. could not call yourself a realtor, you'd be a real estate licensee unless you went and joined another association that were members. We'd have to go out and find our own,
Do you need to know?
insurance. There's about, and it still does not do anything to help your legal liability. For the previous 4 years, so even if we were to change our rule today, say we're not even gonna withdraw. It doesn't do anything.
Are you guys changing the buyer agent, buyer broker representation document that's currently in use?
So that is under review right now as well, to look at of how, if any changes need to be made to the buyer broker. So we do have a standard form buyer broker agreement, but that's also under.
In the same content, are you, looking at the listing agreement, possibly having the commission line, or the purchase contract with a commission paragraph in it?
The exclusive right to sell?
No.
The purchase contract.
Oh, the purchase contract.
Like the commercial purchase contract.
Yes, actually, yeah, because Kathy Tucker and Rob Tucker and I were on an email about that exact document last week.
Because then it brings it to the forefront. When you're writing the offer with the buyer, you're gonna say, oh, by the way, we have to talk about commission.
Yeah, we're looking.
So let me ask you, if in this scenario, because I just did it this weekend, would it be illegal?
Instead
Just spice.
I'm not going to tell you my answer, it depends.
So a client calls me and we were gonna list their house in the spring. They said, our neighbor came across the yard and said, we wanna buy your house for $550. They said, we're happy with the $550. Talking to me, what would you charge to just pull the deal together for us? So I gave them my number and they said, great. So I said, give me your neighbor's name and number and I'll walk them through it and see if they want me to represent them too, or what the whole deal is. So I call, find out the neighbor has a brother who's a realtor. And so the brother who's a realtor calls me and says, yes, my brother wants to make an offer on your client's home. I said, okay, well, they've discussed it and they decided $550 is the price. So he sends over an offer where it is $550, but he's put in a X amount commission for himself in there. So I called him up and I said, no, the price was $550 before you came along. So we're gonna counter by adding your commission to the price of the home. And now that's the price. So go back to your brother, if he wants you to represent him, the agreed upon amount was X. I've negotiated my commission within the X, within that price. You need to go back and do the same. So would that be illegal in the scenario to tell someone, okay, that you have a buyer broker, just add their commission to the price of the home, like we used to do with closing costs back in 2003, where you just throw it on there and hope it appraises. So
I'm gonna say, from an association standpoint, that's probably not our purview. That's a broker discussion to have, rather than an
It's like,
association.
someone said, I wanna buy your house, an agreement. And there was never disclosure about the second realtor. There was the seller said, hey, I got a realtor, you might hold us together. So then when does the second realtor come in? Then when does procuring costs come in?
That's
right.
And then, so I would say whatever you did, I would agree with that, hey, you gotta go back, because my seller wants the $550,
Right.
which
Yep.
includes my compensation.
And by the way, that deal was procured before you came in to the picture.
Well, that's procuring costs.
Well, yeah, that, maybe the brother called the neighbor across the street, said, go over there and do this.
Yeah,
You know.
no, they said they've been talking about it for 6 months and the realtor showed up,
Right.
On
There's money
Friday.
on the table, that's-
last Friday. So, but you are adjusting the price to.
I'm very hesitant to answer that in case it ever comes to arbitration. It does come on attention to that.
It goes back to my point that the buyer has always paid the commission built into the price of a home.
There was an agent, one of our agents brought to my attention this past week, and then the agent to agent remarks, it said. there will be X commission offered to a buyer broker if they were there at the first showing and they were this and they were that, and they did all these things.
Yeah,
But the audience do.
That's
The audience do that as well.
yeah.
So you gotta know yourself.
Or the other thing I was gonna throw out there too is, so you start messing with the closing costs or, you know, whatever, the appraisers. I mean, this home was, you know, the seller offered compensation to the buyer broker agreement and it sold for X. This same home, same neighborhood, same situation sold for X, but didn't. So, I mean, you're really looking at the values of the homes
Yeah, well,
differently.
you know, right now they're not looking at concessions and all that anyway, it's just, here's the price
Yeah.
per square foot. Et cetera, et cetera.
But you remember the days of Ameridream, when
Oh,
they
yeah.
were building the down payment and the price of the home and all,
Yeah.
and 11,000 in closing costs and, you know, all
And
that stuff.
At the end of the day, the best advice I can give you is go do your job. Go do it well. Clearly articulate your value. And especially if you're a buyer rep, know how you're getting paid. Don't pre-fill in anything. Commissions are negotiable, but just go do your job and talk about your value. If you cannot articulate your value to the consumer, I think those are the agents who are going to be in trouble as we move forward. That's what it's gonna boil down to. But if you can articulate your value, you are not pre-filling in your listing agreement compensation, you're able to have that conversation openly, and then it is negotiable. And like I said, there might come a point in time where it's like, well, I've seen all this stuff going on over here in the news, I'm only gonna pay you this amount. Hey, I appreciate the opportunity to do a listing presentation for you, but that's not actually worth my time, and I appreciate the opportunity. You might have to walk away from business at this point, you know? And that's a business decision that individuals are gonna have to make. There are already a whole bunch of different business models out there, a few of you have already mentioned them, that are they're their own business model, right? You're gonna have realtors who are desperate for business, who are going to charge probably less than what you believe you're worth, just to get that business. And how do our members, how do realtors, you know, stay alive? It's the cream of the crop is gonna rise to the top, right? Like that's, you just got, go do your job, do it well, articulate your value, tell your story. And just be transparent to the consumer. That's what it's all gonna come down to.
What's your thoughts about the brokerage name sell for 1%?
It's a business model. It's a business model.
It just hurts the rest of us, that's why.
But I wanna be very careful, Paul, like, cause now we are getting into business models.
Yeah.
Which are not appropriate for this conversation. It's a business model that they have decided that works for them.
But again, it kind of cheapens the rest of the industry.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Can't address it. It's a business model.
It's like a mouth.
Yeah, it keeps up. I mean, before I say another. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have to make too, like.
He'll change another company just like he does every few years, so.
Oh.
It's just about relationship.
Yeah.
It is. But with the onslaught of, you know, these filling your blanks and Outlook and DocuSign, it eliminates the agent being in front of a person and having a conversation.
Yeah,
And when you finally get down to that heart-to-heart conversation, you know, that's where you build a relationship, and then that's where, you know, if you're worth X amount of dollars to help someone buy a house, they're gonna see it. And the more you talk, the more you build your value proposition, the higher your confidence level becomes. And once your confidence level hits a certain point, people buy confidence all day long.
You can see the actual revision on there and say, you weren't worth that. Nobody's ever said that.
I think on this topic, they did it.
Or the fixed pricing,
Hang on.
taxes.
On buyer's representation, we can put that, how much we charge. I know it on this listing agreement, we can put it in, but.
Hey, your buyer's representation, there's a compensation line on there.
Yes, so we can fill that out.
Yeah, this is what I charge. sometimes the seller will offer compensation for this. Yet if they don't, this is what I charge and you would be responsible for it.
Correct.
Yeah, because I feel like.
Yep, yeah, that's what a buyer's agency and buyer representation are two different things, but the buyer's representation agreement, our standard. I think at the bottom of page 1 specifically lays out, what your services are as a buyer's rep, but like Dayla said. I think, I'm trying to read it off the top of my head, it specifically says something to the language of, oftentimes a seller, a listing broker will offer this, if they don't, here are my fees that you would be required to compensate in lieu of listing broker.
And if you don't know what your value proposition is, you haven't figured it out yet, read the purchase contract. It's 13, 14 pages long. There's your duties right there, folks. And the contracts, anytime a contract falls apart, it's because something within that contract is not adhered to. And there's your value proposition.
And one other thing on that is competition.realtor is actually a really good website too, competition.realtor. They have like 187 ways your buyer's agent's worth it and 500. They do. I forget the exact numbers. I probably shouldn't know.
Yeah, I have that listed.
But your sellers, your listing realtor is worth it as well.
Ben Jones posted.
So go to competition.realtor. If you're looking for your value, here's.
It breaks down seller and buyer.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think I read somewhere there was a survey done and 46% of sellers didn't realize that, you know, X% that was being charged for commission, that a piece of that, usually half, you know, they were paying the buyer broker. I thought that was the whole purpose of the consumer guide agency, to educate sellers.
Yeah.
How could it be that high if they read that thing and signed it?
Nobody reads anything is the problem. I mean, just like they said, Mark said earlier, Donald, the consumer goes, I trust you, just send me the paperwork, let's get it done, you know, they don't take the time.
And
And
that's,
that's bad business practice for anyone.
that's exactly why we're adding new paragraphs to the exclusive right to sell. And at the bottom, where you're gonna sign it twice, is I have fully read and understand the contract and have had the opportunity to ask the listing broker any further questions.
And I think to ask about the proceeds at every listing agreement where it breaks down. Yeah, that really surprised me when you saw. Yeah, the estimate of proceeds breaks down. Yeah, it's really, when you said that there was. You know, testimony about, I never knew that the buyers, that's just hard for me to believe. I don't know.
They did.
Yeah,
The only-
that has to be the minority, I just.
I mean, honestly, let's call it what it is. The only people who are gonna win in this are the attorneys.
Yeah,
If that's who's going to ultimately win, but in the meantime, you still, not in the meantime, period, you have to go talk about your value and what you do.
sure.
You know, if they think you're putting a lockbox and a sign in their yard and putting it on the MLS, or you're opening the lockbox and simply just generically filling out a contract, you've completely diminished your value. There was one major association in Ohio, Columbus, who their MLS went down. It was hijacked.
Yeah,
There were more than one, but one of them was really big. And at one point, some of their leadership said, we should just use Facebook as our listing platform. You want to talk about completely diminishing your value as a realtor by saying, hey, just go find your house on Facebook. Yeah, it was. It's like, why are we telling people to go find their house on Facebook?
Yeah.
Like, if consumers truly believe they can go find their property on Facebook and that's your listing platform, you've got a problem. And you have no guaranteed compensation in that one anyway. I mean, period. So.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions?
Just one more comment for everyone. If you wanna learn how, or watch how to explain real estate compensation to your clients, NAR has a couple videos.
Yeah.
Which are pretty decent. I would take some time, and if you're on a team, show your team members individually, go to your NAR subscription and log in and watch a couple of these videos on how to talk.
And two real quick, I think that.
I'm sorry, one of the things that gets me is I don't call it a commission. call it this is how we get compensated. This is, yeah, you know, I think terminology is a big thing too. Because then you have commission breath, you ever hear that one before? And you know, talk about this is how the broker gets compensated. And whatever your split is, you know, we've already come to those agreements. We're concluding there, Al. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, you and I talked about this the other day. I mean, I keep actually, when we were doing our business plan, just talking about this going forward. Ohio was made a really big push a couple years ago about the C2EX designation. I think that is a huge thing. I'm talking about value proposition. I think designations are gonna become a thing that's gonna be relevant when you're sitting down at the table, right? So Caleb's like, hey, we need to make sure we have our stuff in line. So that's something that we've been working on, but that was a very long process, that C2EX. I mean, it's probably 40 hours.
Yeah, 20.
Kevin Hart's working at trying to bring the ABR designation here to our office to get our agents.
Yeah, so I think those are things to think about.
Yep. I agree with that, Steve.
Yeah.
All right, it's 4:30. I mean, I don't want to keep you that long. Good, an hour and a half. Good.
Well, I was gonna say, this is your mastermind, you guys, if there's anything else you want to discuss, challenges or anything you have. You know, this is a time to do it too, even if it's not.
Yeah, I can leave my room, so you guys can talk.
You're welcome.
Okay. Oh, okay, yeah, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But that is still on this over yet? It's close to that, yeah. No,
They still answered the phone though, Ted, we're helping this morning.
yeah, we're working, we're just working remote. We're going through a complete network upgrade, so we'll continue to drop calls. Yeah, right, I mean, there's nothing worse than being on the side. Everything crashes. See ya, thank you. Thank you for letting me use your conference room.
No, thank you for, well, yeah. thank-
Yeah.
This year.
Talking about.
You know, I think guys, Tim brought like a really good. One of our. Tuesday, so all the work in the transaction, because it's them targeting about it.